Hi everyone, and welcome back to One Autistic Person. Today I'm going to be looking at the diagnosis process again. So this is the third video, which is going to look at the first sort of face-to-face, in-person, with another person assessment. We've already looked at the pre-screening in a previous video. And then this is the next step. So for my second assessment, these assessments are quite often done in different orders depending on who does your assessment. But this one is the ADOS 2 module 4. So that's the Autism Diagnosis Observation Schedule, second edition. I just have to put it out there that for me, every time I hear the word ADOS, it makes me, and especially ADOS 2, it makes me think of the planet from Doctor Who, ADOS 2. So any Doctor Who fans, that's straight where my head goes to, is ADOS 3. So anyway, that out of the way, we're going to be looking at the ADOS 2 module 4. Now, the Autism Diagnosis Observation Schedule, second edition, obviously is a second edition version of an assessment that is done that's around observing you. There's a lot of talking. I think it's meant to be semi-structured, so there are certain questions that need to be asked. But I think that it seems to be much more about observing how you respond to those answers, as well as the answers themselves. But I think it's more to do with how you react to that situation and how you react when you're talking to the person, any physical or verbal giveaways of the fact that you may be autistic. I believe it's also used for the ADHD assessment sometimes as well. I think it's more predominantly done to diagnose autism, bearing in mind that it's called the Autism Diagnosis Observation Schedule. So they also, with adults, so obviously with me, they use module 4, which is a developed version of the original ADOS assessments, which is for adults. So it's a bit of a strange one because it's very clearly, when you're doing certain parts of the assessment, some task-based things that we'll get into later, it's very clear that it was originally done for children, and that they've adjusted it and adapted it for adults, which the assessor that I had confirmed that's what it was, and she said that it may feel a little bit strange to you, which it did. But I do think, looking back on it, I can see the reason why they use that, because the bits that they use, which are generally around the storytelling parts of it, as much as it feels quite childish to some extent, it does look at imagination, and it does look at how you, as a potential autistic person, would tell a story, how you would see something and be able to continue with something, or how to use your imagination in a way that is quite unusual, and not a way that you would tend to do things in life, or certainly I wouldn't have. As with all of these videos, this is purely my opinion, my way of how I have experienced this diagnosis process, and all my videos are going to be like that. It is purely from my perspective. The reason why I've called the channel One Autistic Person is that it literally is the opinion and experience of one autistic person and how I experience the world. My hope is that will resonate with some people, and that's the whole point of these. So just want to make it clear that when I say anything in this video and any other, it is purely my opinion of it and my experience of it. So first of all, the way that it was arranged was, all of my assessment stuff was arranged basically over email. They were very, very good when they specifically asked at the beginning, how do I prefer to be communicated with? And I basically said written communications, whether that be email, text messages. I would much rather do that than speak over the phone, because I absolutely hate speaking on the phone. They were very, very good with that arrangement, and they also, because I'd sent over, as I pointed out in the video that I previously did, that I had that I was nervous and had given them all this information, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. They'd picked up on the fact that I was quite nervous about it, and they kind of asked whether I wanted it to be done as quickly as possible, and that was the agreement, was that they would do it as quickly as they possibly could for me, which for me I need to do. I ruminate a lot and get very worried if the longer the time period is for something, I don't feel better about it. So it was really good that they asked those questions and asked how I wanted this process to be. It was very much right from the beginning all about how I felt and how I wanted the process to be and how I would feel comfortable with that process. So it was done on the internet, done over the over Zoom or Teams. I think it was Teams. It was done over, and I was extremely nervous that day. Not helped by the fact that I'd got my whole setup of my microphone and that type of thing, and I first of all, when I first went onto it, the camera wasn't working, so that had stressed me out. I'd gone on 20 minutes early to make sure that I was there in time. It had taken me nearly the 20 minutes to do that, and then once the assessor came up, I couldn't hear her. So I quickly had to get my headphones, so I was very, very nervous right from the beginning, but she was great. She sort of put me at ease very, very quickly, explained what was going to happen, what the process was going to be, not to worry about things, just to be myself. And I would say the biggest thing, one of the things that I read a lot about when I was sort of researching what happens in the ADOS 2 and the assessment process in general, was that there was a lot of talk around making sure that you tried to unmask. That terminology was used quite a lot, and on reflection, that's what I thought about doing, but I realised it wasn't until I got my assessment back that I really understood where I was masking and what masking actually meant to me personally. And I focused quite a lot on unmasking, and actually, in reality, all I needed to be was myself, because one of the things that came up in my assessment was that it was very clear that I was masking at the beginning of the process, but it was clear to my assessor that my masking dissipated, that my facial movements and facial expressions changed, that my tone of voice became much more monologued. A good assessor is going to notice that. So it's not about necessarily unmasking. It's about feeling comfortable. For me, what I would like people to do is to go into the assessment feeling as comfortable as you ever will do in what is a very stressful situation. It's an unknown. It's something you've never done before. It's meeting somebody that you've probably never met. There's a lot of stress factors. There's a lot of things there that are going to sort of trigger responses which could be quite difficult to deal with. But I would say, rather than focusing on unmasking, because like I say, a good assessor will pick that up. They will pick up that you're masking, and they'll probably see you masking and unmasking throughout the process. Don't focus on unmasking, but also don't try and mask and don't try and unmask. Just be yourself in that moment, and they will be able to see it, and they will be able to pick up on things. They certainly, my assessors were very they obviously had done stuff throughout the assessment, asked me certain questions, like asked me specifically about me going on holiday and why I like doing that. I then went into a whole monologue of explaining why I love to go to Tenerife, and that's where I like to go, and I'd love to go to other places, but I feel safer going there, and I know that I'm safe with everything, and that I know what I'm going to do, and I can plan it and can see it and not worry about it. My assessor then told me about where she liked to go on holiday, and from the assessment that I got back, I didn't really have done this until afterwards, and I've now looked at it, and I definitely did this. I just said, "Oh, that's nice." So it wasn't. I didn't ask any further questions and go into any more detail with that, and I thought it was lovely that that's a place that she wanted to go. I just didn't ask any further questions. So they pick up on little things like that. So there'll be lots of things I'll throw in where they'll be able to find those autistic traits that are individual to you, and they are certainly looking at it from an individual perspective. Seeing when other people have talked about their diagnosis, there's complete differences in it, but the same result. But you can see how those traits diverge and join together and are very similar. One of the biggest things that I remember is quite early on, because of the fact that I'd got stressed about the headphones, there was a mention of had I thought about getting an ADHD diagnosis, HDMI? No. An ADHD assessment, should I say. That was mentioned quite early on, which I'd already kind of been thinking about, and that just solidified that for me as well. So that was nice that they weren't, she was clearly noticing other things as well as not just going, oh, right, I need to focus on your autism. There were also talks around other mental health consequences and things like that. So it was a lovely chat. It was actually quite nice once I got over the initial, oh my God, this is hell for me. So we then went into a discussion around what was going to happen. She explained that there would be some tasks involved in it, not to worry about them. And then we moved on to sort of going through my early life based on the information that I'd supplied to them in the screening questionnaires. So they just delve into more detail into that and ask you for how you felt about it, and so it's just more in-depth conversations about it, which is where there was sort of an understanding of me with social interaction. So they talked a lot about social interaction, but then we covered how the relationship with my family and that type of thing, how I saw school, how school felt for me. So rather than it being this quite literal systematic way of me explaining things as I did in the development assessment questionnaire, this was more about how did that make you feel and delving more into it. So it's quite a hard conversation to have because you start remembering a lot, but just say what there is there. That's what I would say, is just be really clear with them, explaining what happened, just let yourself flow with it, and they want to hear as much as possible. And then there was a discussion at this point around why I was seeking the diagnosis, and for me the reason for seeking the diagnosis was for my own personal exploration of things. I needed to know why life had been so different for me, why I found so many things challenging, why school was the way it was, why I asked so many questions of myself. As I sort of said in my original, my first video that I did on this channel, which was my pre-diagnosis, sort of leading up to and why I went for the diagnosis. So I kind of had that conversation. So not to plug my own video or anything, but if you go back and watch that, that's kind of where that conversation came from. And then she went into the first task. So she pulled up it was a picture book story without words. I think there was words at the beginning. I think there was the first few lines which she read out to me, but there were very vivid pictures. Now with this, because I don't feel comfortable sort of going too much into the specifics of those stories, because I don't want to give anybody sort of worry for it or information about it that might help them along with it, because I don't think it's about helping people along with that storytelling. I do want to demystify it a little bit, and but it does feel silly. When you're doing it, it feels very silly. I think it's specifically meant to be silly. It's meant to make you feel like it's silly, and I think it's meant to go down the route of looking at things like idioms and abstract comedy, and I was just very confused by it all. So she starts telling the story, and then I continued telling the story badly. I was just confused by it all, and in the assessment, and it was, so she talked to me afterwards about the idioms that I'd missed within it, which afterwards I was kind of like, yeah, but then asked me to explain what those idioms meant. Now, the idioms I thought I knew or understood, I apparently explained them in a way that wasn't actually how other people see them, which was interesting because it means I've been using certain idioms that I thought I was using correctly. I've maybe been using them in the right context, but not thinking about it in the same way that other people do, which was really interesting, but not going to go into that because it would go specifically into the idioms. It was basically like a mad dream. It was like a fever dream type story that I was looking at. But she talked straight away and asked me, one of the idioms, she said, have you ever heard this idiom, as part of the conversation? And then we got into the conversation around idioms. Now, what I realised is that with idioms and metaphor and things like that, I tend to be okay using an idiom if I understand the origins of that idiom. By idiom, I mean when it's something like saying getting caught red-handed. Now, if I'm using get caught red-handed because I've understood the concept of that one from straight away. I understood that if you're in trouble, you've done something wrong, having red hands could indicate that you've done something very bad, and that was very clear to me. But wearing your heart on your sleeve, for instance, is something that has always really confused me. So I quite often look into the reasons why that idiom exists, where it came from, what the origins are. And once I understand the historic origins of it, whether it's linguistic or it's situational or there's a very valid reason for it, once I know that valid reason, I can use the idiom. So there's certain idioms that I just find confusing and don't like using, and there's other ones, but I certainly don't necessarily see them in a comedy sense and things like that, which is what this was. And in my assessment, it had said that I hadn't picked up on a few idioms within it, and I hadn't seen the comedy in it. I definitely didn't see comedy in that story, and I have racked my brains to try and work out where the comedy actually was in that story or those pictures, because to me they were just weird. It wasn't comical, and I think it's because it's quite abstract comedy that they're trying to use, because they want to see whether you will see sort of maybe beyond the pictures and beyond the logical. I have thought about emailing her to ask why it was funny, but that would be a bit strange. But I may do eventually if I never work out why it was funny. So that was then, there was a little bit of a breakdown after that where she kind of explained, like I say, the idioms and what I'd missed in the idioms there, and asked whether I understood them, and that opened up a conversation into idioms and communication in general, and people saying things when people say things that they don't mean, and a much bigger conversation, which I think all of these lead to as well, is that it sort of gets you to answer how you experience the world, which then kind of led on to questions about emotions and personal relationship and how work affects me. So this was the bit where I believe that, because one of the things that came out in my assessment and that she mentioned to me, but was definitely part of my assessment, was alexithymia, which is a difficulty in identifying emotions. And I tried to explain emotions, and I already knew that this was sort of a problem for me previously, and I've always realised that I can't really explain how an emotion feels or what emotion I'm feeling at any given time. I can kind of know that I'm happy or sad, and that's about it. There's not really anything else in between those feelings, and it's always the same feeling. So we talked quite a bit around emotions, which, like I say, that was then where part of the diagnosis said that I'm likely to be somebody who has alexithymia, and then we talked about personal relationships. So I talked about the fact that I have one friend at a time. I can't really deal with anything more than that. I can have more than one friend, obviously, but I can only really focus on one friend, and quite often I focus quite heavily on that friend, and everybody else I will not really speak to. I really struggle to have multiple friendships at the same time. We talked about my family and how I see my family and how I see the other people in my life, the closeness that I feel or lack of closeness that I feel to people, and then we talked about like social anxiety and sort of things like that. But then talking about work was quite an in-depth part of the discussion that we had, because it's one of the places where I've struggled the most, but probably masked the most as well. So my social interactions at work, I really struggle with at home, and will ruminate over them for a really long period of time. I will practice conversations before I have them multiple times for multiple different people if I've got multiple different things to talk to people about. And as I manage quite a few people, sort of 13, 14 people directly, I have to have multiple conversations all the time. Now, if I'm thrown into a conversation, I will deal with it. I then ruminate a lot over each one of those conversations afterwards. But if I've got a conversation planned, so if I had a meeting where I needed to talk about something that was contentious or something that was upsetting for the other person, if I needed to have a conversation around somebody else's personal life, that type of thing, that I knew was coming, I will spend a lot of time trying to get ready for that conversation and practice it, to the point of sometimes thinking I've already had the conversation, which can then mean that I when I'm having the conversation don't go maybe as in depth as I have when I've practiced those conversations. I can practice them out loud, I can practice them in my head, I write them down, I'll type them up, whatever it is. There's multiple different ways that I will deal with that, and then I'll ruminate about that conversation afterwards. And it can be that just one meeting for me could have taken up probably 10 hours worth of my life, maybe more if it's a really complex situation, which I realised how draining that's been on me as a person, but also how much that has an effect on my work. So yeah, that was quite interesting, and that's then made me look at sort of reasonable adjustments and things at work. And my conversations that I've had with my line manager have been sort of based around that thought process and how I deal with it moving forward. I'm not sure we will ever be able to do it, but it really highlighted it as part of that, part of this assessment. So we also looked at, within that there was then the sort of wider social interactions and how I process these. So things like going to the supermarket, I have to prep to go to the supermarket. It can take me a few hours to go, but to actually go to a supermarket, simply because I need to have time before it to get ready to go and get through that transition of leaving the house. I have to get there, I have to go through the motions that I have to go through, which I will touch on in another video that I'm planning on doing around how I deal with situations outside the home and sort of like shopping and those difficult places for me. Actually going through it, and then I have to decompress afterwards. And it's so I talked about that. So I talked about familial interactions. So if I'm going to go and see my mum, which I said even that can be quite difficult, or because I don't know what's going to happen on the way there. I don't know. There's so many unknowns, and I don't know what social interactions I'm going to have with my mum. Even though all of my social interactions are positive, I still worry about them. But then there's the unfamiliar. So, like I say, like the supermarket, or if I was going somewhere that I didn't know, and the social anxieties that I have. So, had a quite a long chat around that. And then sort of discussing about interests, what I do in my spare time, how I feel about those interests. So this is where we sort of talked about how intense my interests are around things like The Sims, about tornadoes, about theme parks, the things that are my intense interests, and how, like I say, how I feel about them, how it makes me feel when I'm involved in them, when I can't do them, that type of thing. So we talked quite heavily about those things, and again that was another point where my assessor sort of put in quite a few bits about her life and about what she enjoys and that type of thing. And I feel like now looking back on it, I just wanted to talk about my things and sort of didn't really ask her much about her experiences and why she liked those things and things like that. So that was interesting. And then the sort of last part of it was, so before the assessment, they'd asked me to have, I think it was 5 items. They'd given suggestions of what they could be. I can't actually remember now what the things were. I know there was a spoon, because it had said a spoon, a battery. I think it was a key, some money. I think it was a 50p, because it specifically said a 50p. And I can't remember what the other one was. And so the assessor, so with this one, the assessor did the story first, and basically what they do is ask you to use each one of them to tell a story. So tell a full story using all 5 of those items to go through the story. And she told the story about a spoon falling over into a puddle, and she did really well with it. It's fantastic. But I'm guessing hers she'd been able to sort of go through that many times previously. Mine was very much pick this up, say what it does, pick this up, say what it does. But I started it off the same way that she did. So she'd animated the spoon. She'd anthropomorphized the spoon. So it was that's what I did. So I anthropomorphized the spoon and then told this story about it being a writer. That was the other thing. It was a pencil. So I told a story about it being a writer and then getting paid and then going out for a walk, and it got lost and lost his energy, and that was it. And it was so simple, so systematic. When I look back on it now, it was like which is interesting because I can write fiction. I have written fiction, and I don't think it's that bad. But having to do it in that situation and think on the spot of that kind of thing was extremely challenging for me. But I also realised I am quite systematic in the way that I do write fiction. So I'll write it by hand, then I will rethink it. I'll write it back out by hand again, and then I'll type it up, and then I'll retype it up again after I've edited it. So I've had to put a lot into that for me to get to that point. I can't sort of organically write if it's fiction. I can organically write if it's non-fiction. So that was quite interesting to look at. So that was basically the assessment. I've sped through that as I do with everything. Like I say, it was a nice experience. So she discussed next steps and what was going to happen. Then there would be another assessment that was going to be had that was going to go more into my experiences rather than this, which was more sort of looking overarchingly at things. It was about an hour long, I think, the assessment. It may have been just under or just over, I can't remember exactly, but it was around about an hour long. It felt way shorter. I honestly felt like it went really, really quickly. Looking back on it, for me, like I say, I want to sort of finish this video off by reiterating that don't try to unmask. For me personally, this is the way I would look at it. Don't try to unmask. Don't try to mask. Don't try to do either of those things. Don't try to force anything. Go into it wanting this person to see you for who you are, whether that is that you mask or you don't mask within that situation. Just don't actively think about those things as much as you possibly can. Just go, this person wants to know me and wants to assess me as a person so that they can know whether I am autistic, and then that will lead on to the benefits and the understanding that you'll get from having an assessment and a potential diagnosis. But they're not there to catch you out. That's not what they're there for. They are there to look to see whether you have autism. They are looking at you through autistic or autism assessing glasses. They're not looking at it just randomly. They will see those things if they're there. And if they come back with a diagnosis that it's not, they may think it's ADHD, or they may have other suggestions for you. They may not be a good assessor. I don't know what, obviously they're not every assessor is going to be a good one. And I'm sure there are some out there that are looking to try and not diagnose people with autism. I believe with mine, it wasn't about whether I was being diagnosed with autism or I wasn't being diagnosed with autism. It was about whether I had autism. It wasn't about the diagnosis. They wanted to do the best for me. They wanted me to get what I needed out of a diagnosis or an assessment, and were very clear on the fact they would be very honest at all times in it. And they were extremely honest, and they were lovely, lovely people, very to the point, and very. You could tell when I look back on it, I didn't feel this at the time, but when I look back on it, it was very clear that there were certain things being done during the ADOS 2 that were meant to make me react in a certain way, sort of leading questions, like I said. But there was sometimes I needed to be cut off, and they would do that and see whether I would go back to it, which I know I did a few times. That I struggled to let something go if I wanted to continue doing something, that I monologued, all of those type of things. They are seeing all of those things, but I also know that now looking back as well, my assessor was purposely looking away from the camera, which was then making me feel a certain way. So I was trying to correct that, and so it's. But like with everything with me, with my neurodivergency, it definitely makes me assess everything afterwards, and it was quite interesting to assess it. But reading back the assessment and then looking back on it, that's been quite an interesting thing to do as well. So yeah, what I would say is enjoy it as much as you possibly can, because it is a time for you to really be able to experience yourself in a way that you're never really going to experience yourself in with the ADOS 2 assessment. It's an interesting assessment, and I think take it from that. Try to be the least nervous you possibly can be, but being nervous in itself can add to the fact of understanding you as a person, and that is all this is about. It is about understanding you in a way that's slightly structured, so that they can look at certain parts of you as a person to see whether they feel that you're autistic, because obviously they don't make that decision at that point. They have to go to a multidisciplinary team that will then make that decision afterwards based on the report that they're doing there. So this is probably the most enjoyable one out of all of them, out of everything, to be honest with you, with all of it, because it has quite an interesting flow, and you have to do some unusual things, like the storytelling, which I think if you're doing the storytelling bit, because I don't think it's in everyone, but if you do the storytelling bit, it's a really quirky, weird thing to do. So yeah, I would say just enjoy it, do it, and get it over and done with, because it's obviously a very important bit, and it also gave me a lot of insight afterwards as part of the diagnosis. That was the most interesting part of the diagnosis for me, because it was showing observations, it was talking about me and seeing how I'd reacted to things, and it will allow you, if you're yourself during that assessment, it will allow you to see yourself in a different light. And this was probably the most important part of the diagnosis for me to be able to look at myself around masking, around my communication style, around my understanding of other people. There was a lot that I learned from reading through this bit. It was the shorter part of my diagnosis. My next one was a much longer part of my diagnosis. I think it was like 3 pages. My next one this was about 1.5 pages, maybe 2 pages, but this bit was the bit that gave me the most information about me, because it was a true observation in an objective way about me as a person, and that was really interesting to look back on. So I'm so glad that I had the ADOS 2 as part of that assessment, and that I had the assessor that I had. Again, the assessor that I used was Veritas Assessments, absolutely fantastic. Jo, who is the director of that company, of that organisation, she is the person who did the ADOS 2 for me. Brilliant woman, absolutely amazing assessor. She used to be the lead director for autism services in Wales, I believe, so really knows what she's on about. And that's the other thing I would say about your assessors. They tend to be really, really involved in what they do, love what they do, and really are knowledgeable about it. They're, like I say, not there to catch you out, but there to tell your story in an assessment. And that is basically what an ADOS 2 assessment does, is tells a story of you as a person objectively, in a way that you can take information away from it, as well as get the diagnosis if that's what's the right thing to do. So thank you very much for listening to this video and me rambling on as usual. I hope you find any of that useful. Like I say, that's what I want these videos to be. I want them to be as real as possible. I want them to be as informative as possible. I know I've kept some information back on like the storytelling stuff and things like that, but it would be unfair of me to sort of tell you about the story, because it just would give you too much information, which I don't think is the purpose of it. But yes, I want them to be, these videos to be informative, to be real, for you to feel that I'm having a conversation with you as much as that's possible in a one-sided situation around these things that I've already experienced, which you may be thinking about experiencing, or if there's going to be people around you that are having this experience, that is the experience they're going to be having. You know, it's going to be stressful beforehand. They'll probably be assessing things quite a lot afterwards, and the report can be quite telling about people. And if you are watching it on behalf of a family member or a friend that's going to have the assessments, ask if they want to talk through it with them. You know, this is life-changing for people, for them to notice this and to see things from an objective perspective. But if they've gone for the assessment, especially as an adult, as a person who's going for a late diagnosis, they want to know about themselves, and this is going to tell them a lot of information. But what I would say is openly listen to it and let them talk about how reading the information on this has affected them and how they feel about that. Thank you again, and I hope that I see you in the next video. If you could like, comment and subscribe. I always feel really awkward saying that, but please do, because it makes a massive, massive difference to things. I would be eternally grateful. Thank you, and hopefully see you in the next one.